As two creative individuals, we are highly curious and inquisitive of how things work, how those different disciplines intersect and translate to positive human experiences. On Pixel and Pop, you're going to be hearing us talk about business, design. We'll also be sharing stories, experiences of our own. Ladies and gentlemen, you're listening to the very first episode of Pixel and Pop. Andrew and I are going to tell you a little bit about our backstory, what made and shaped us as designers, and what has led us to be where we are now. I am currently working as a creative director in a consulting environment. And Andrew?
Yeah, I work as the head of design in a product company.
Our intention for this show is to dissect how this design and business meet. What are those different converging lines? How can design make an impact to business outcomes? We want to share our personal experiences, basically where we had that first conversation.
I remember having that call to sort of talk about, we think we have some unique perspectives here, different perspectives, because we're in different types of companies with different backgrounds, but we really both obviously like the creative field, but also have passion for entrepreneurship and building businesses and tying these things together. I thought, who better to have this adventure with than Paul?
I love that idea as well, because you come from this product background, which I know very little about. And my experience comes from branding, marketing, advertising. You know, people would call this as traditional, but I'm like, no, until we go under this psychological evolution as a species, nothing is going to change. Problems that existed are still going to be human problems. And I am tuned to solve business problems made for humans.
That's a nice speech. You could run an agency off of that.
What time is it? 9:22, and we've just we've just ended our 9 to 5 shift. I actually like this hour because it's like late night with Paul and Andrew on Pixel and Pop.
That's a really nice idea. If we get that deep, slow voice, really make it quite sexy. I think that could be a thing.
That could totally be a thing. You know what? I'm single and I might just draw the right kind of audience to the show.
As long as we get an audience, that's all that matters, really.
As long as we get an audience. That's so true. I think I remember sitting with you in the very hip and cool Kensington Market. And you told me this very fun story.
And so I would have been 13 or 14, I think. And we got our first computer. And the thing that I was just enamored with was the idea that I could, type out the code that was in the last page of the book to make a video game, like little Space Invaders, I think it was. But it just opened my eyes to the possibilities of what you could do. Fast forward a couple of years and ActionScript came out, Macromedia put it out. And the idea that you could make something that moved, so a little bit of coding, but also this visual element is amazing. It just blew my mind. Absolutely blew my mind.
Oh my God. Video games. I remember the days of playing Tetris, and then there was this game called Contra and Super Mario.
Yep. There was a game we used to play called, I don't know if you ever played it, but it was just the most ghetto thing in the world. Battle Tetris. Take on your friends, kill them, blow them up. Totally screw up someone's game mid-game.
Battle Tetris. Okay.
Yeah. So I loved the Space Invaders game. And then I figured out a couple of years later that I could try and recreate it with Adobe's ActionScript and Macromedia. Or I guess it was Macromedia at the time. And that just opened a world. We had GeoCities website back then. People were looking to do something hip and interesting and cool with neon green backgrounds, right? And flashing banners. So I got into the game of creating flash animation banners. That was my first side hustle. I was 15, I think.
I just love that story that you started off so early and getting, I think for anybody, especially a creative person, when you kind of get an early taste of that thing that you're doing for fun can translate to money. And that first time you do that transaction is so empowering and so powerful. So how was it for you at that time?
Yeah. Well, at that time, I was also sort of living in my basement. I mean, this coincides with a story, I got expelled from high school because I just stopped going. I got hooked on all this stuff, computers, what that could possibly be. So I literally was the kid living in the basement, at white glow off the monitor, lights off, in the dark, pounding away on the keyboard. That was my life for a few years. But that also meant, no prospects, right? No money, nothing really going on. So this idea that I could just take this thing that for me was kind of fun to play with and somehow make a little bit of money off of it, that was mind blowing. Just another another level of opportunity, you know?
By the way, Andrew, I want to know a little bit more about what got you kicked out of school. Let's tell our audience and get the scoop on this.
You miss a day, and then it's a bit harder to catch up. And then so you're like, oh, I missed 2 days, you missed 3 days. All of a sudden you go back. I remember going back to school, really trying to do the right thing. Missing a month of school. And I showed up in my math class. I remember my teacher looking at me like, what the hell are you doing here? I had no idea what's going on. None. Absolutely none. And I was like, you know what? I'm out. I'm not coming back.
When is the first time you actually got to make something?
At this point, I'm going to say I was probably 19, maybe.
Right.
Maybe.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Cool.
Friend of mine who ran an agency, a photography agency, is like, hey, I need a new website. I was like, well, obviously I'm the best person I know at this, which of course I wasn't. And this was like my first taste of working with a real client, but he paid me for it. Not a ton, but at that point, in hindsight, at that point, it was like mind blowing. I think I made like $1,000 for the website.
Holy shit!
Holy shit! $1,000. That was a really great experience. When I valued myself, which was interesting. I always valued myself based on what the most recent person would pay me. So now I was like, well, clearly I am amazing because someone just paid me $1,000 to build this stupid Flash website.
Hopefully they're not listening, and it was not a stupid Flash website. It was an amazing,
it was
fun project.
Amazing. Yeah, stands the test of time, really. That was a relationship that I had with him that was really great. And he was really, I think, honestly trying to help me out. He saw something in me and he knew that I could use a break. So I think that was really kind of him to give me that shot. But what it really resulted in is that he was instrumental in me getting my next lead, which was to build a site for a high-end grocery mall chain in North York. And the thing is, I didn't know these people at all. He somehow connected to work with them, and he negotiated my fee for me. So he said, "Okay, I have this place. They're friends of mine. They need a new site. I've done all the photography for them. You just need to put the site together." Oh, this is great. And, it's another $1,000 job. He had gone in and convinced them to pay me $3,500.
Wow.
So I was
holy shit.
Yeah. And this was like within a year, right? Of doing these two jobs. And I had done nothing in between. And so I was like, well, someone's going to pay me that much money? It's amazing. But of course, you have imposter syndrome. But I went with these people, fantastic people. But what I'll say is not friendly client, meaning they owed me nothing, right? They weren't going to sort of sweep any mistakes I made under the rug. They had pretty clear idea of what they wanted. So I remember working on this project and I was horrible. Everything I put together was garbage. They'd look at it and be like, oh, that's not what we want at all. Like, just, you are so wrong that we don't know why we're working with you. That kind of thing. And I remember losing a ton of sleep over it. I just couldn't figure it out. Being stressed out and trying to fall asleep. And just the site was not working. I thought I was going to lose the job, but get back the money, all that kind of stuff. And then at about 2 a.m. I woke, right? So I run over, grab a scrap of paper, draw some square boxes, rough idea, go back to bed. Next day, and about an hour and a half, 2 hours, taking this really rough sketch, putting it together in Photoshop and shipping it off to the client. I think I had to wait about a day, but they got back to me like, this is perfect. This is exactly what we wanted.
Oh my God. So after you basically showed them a couple of designs, then you finally came up with something. And I think you told me a little bit of a story, which was, this is where that interest, that nuance was when we were sitting. I remember when we were sitting in the Kensington market, I think you went something on the lines of, and I don't want to, you can better explain this, but it was that initially you were kind of overthinking it. And then finally, when it hit you, it was like the answer was there in front of you, but you were kind of skirting around it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I spent so much time stressing over it, interpret too much of what I thought they wanted, instead of probably just listening to the feedback they were actually giving me. Yeah, it worked out, which is great because now the important thing here is now I had a paying client who'd pay me $3,500, which meant I would never work again for less than $3,500.
So tell me how off I'm on this observation, but this is my hunch, okay? Which is that when somebody goes from, making nothing for what they do, especially as a creative person, and they make that first bit of money, and then when they actually go from, let's say, $100 to $1,000, and then from $1,000, when $3,500 was handed to you, I think you rightfully said that you got this imposter syndrome. So you wanted to over deliver. Whereas the person that hired you for the skills that they already saw. So they didn't hire you for your potential, but they hired you for the work that you already did.
But I started early enough, both as from an age perspective, getting into it. And I didn't really know anyone else who was doing it. Really a community that existed for this sort of thing. So I was also trying to learn on my own, right? You'd have to like order a book from Amazon or Chapters and wait 3 weeks for it to show up. And then it was really hard to get feedback to know if you actually were good at what you were doing.
I would say that for all the people listening below who were born after the year 2000, we didn't have the internet or cell phones or resources or, UI, UX testing, websites. And, we didn't have the Creative Cloud. We didn't have, InVision. We didn't have any of these crazy tools that we have and resources that we have today.
Yeah. And that first computer that I got, it kicked all this off. My entire career off, where I am today, where I'm heading. I got that before there was even internet available for me. I could not buy it. First computer I ever got was a Commodore 64, tape deck and big monitor, but that's it. I could pound away on the keys and make this game, and that was the end of it. There was no internet. All of this was very formative. I finally got to the point where someone would pay me money to do this thing that, in my eyes, I'd been screwing around, wasting time instead of going to school. Very exciting, right?
Right.
But I agree.
Yeah.
I think your earlier point is some interesting merit. Others saw in me, I think, things that I could not see. And I think that a lot of people, that's the foundation of it, right? It's there's that gap between how you see yourself and how others.
And that's where you really begin to translate it into a career or, a profession.
And things related to imposter syndrome, they're kind of, in my eyes, they're related is just, you need to get to a point where you're super comfortable with being wrong, with acknowledging that you're going into this, whatever the work is that you're doing, it's not going to be perfect. It could very well be very wrong to begin with. And if your ego is wrapped up in needing to be right the first time or not being able to take that criticism well, and I think that builds that imposter syndrome. It gets it bigger and bigger. And that gets in the way of you doing good work.
That is, I think, such a brilliant insight. For the audience listening, and if you're like a business owner and you're trying to hire a creative person to help you with whatever that thing is, one quality that you want to look for is in a very senior creative is they will constantly ask you questions. Okay, but what does that mean? They will not pretend or come off as knowing everything. Because once you reach that senior level, you stop trying hard to prove yourself. And now you get to this point where you're like, okay, actually, wait, I actually don't have all the answers. And you begin asking more inquisitive and curious questions, nuanced qualities that you can look for when trying to find the right creative person to help you.
This was a two-way conversation. So let's hear a little bit about your backstory, which I think was very, very interesting. And, geographically very distant from mine, but perhaps we shared some similar themes. I'd love to hear your story.
So my story actually begins from India, where I was like Andrew. I was thrown out of school about 6 times. I was thrown out of every single class. My principals and my teachers had a really tough time with me. I would go into an exam and not write a word. I was really bad at studies.
You were very dedicated though. 6 times. That's a lot of dedication.
I was always caught drawing in school, in class, in college. From college, when I went into my first postgraduate program in advertising and media communications, that's where my life really turned around, where I got exposed to the advertising world. By the way, this story is in Mumbai, and I am at Nariman Point, which is probably one of the most expensive pieces of real estate in Mumbai. And that's where you have the Express Towers, which is basically where Low Lintas was headquartered. And I go up to the 16th floor, the doors open, and I see people in shorts, flip-flops, and then I also see side by side people in suits. And I'm like, what? Wow. This is possible? Yeah. This is a thing? And immediately I fell in love. Like I knew right away that this is where the rest of my life in advertising, marketing, branding, this is kind of the space that I wanted to be in. It just felt, I felt like right at home. I had never felt better. And then from there, I ran my own agency and studio with a friend of mine, business partner back in India. And we worked on a whole bunch of stuff from airlines to sports teams to music festivals to restaurants, schools, a lot of cool stuff. It was a fun 6 years.
Just to dig in on that for a second, really curious on why you chose that path for yourself to start your own agency rather than, go somewhere where maybe you could be exposed to more senior designers to learn from.
Okay. I think we're going to have to let the audience in on the secret. Well, I wasn't getting hired. People were telling me that, Paul, you're not creative. And I was really struggling to make ends meet. And then finally I was like, fuck it. I'm just gonna do it myself. I'm gonna just start my own agency.
Really grasping your future by the reins here.
This has kind of been my story throughout, is that when I was in school, I was constantly rejected. When I got into the advertising world, which I fell in love with, again, I was rejected. Initially, I was rejected because they were like, you're not creative. And then I did get a job as a copywriter, because initially even though I was an art person, I did start it out as a copywriter because I was really interested in long form copy. And I felt that copywriters were doing all the thinking. That's naturally where I wanted to be. Even though I was a writer in the beginning, I actually enjoyed that more because now I was able to think about my ideas as I was writing them and how they would visualize later. I had the skill of the thinking meeting the execution. So that was really helpful. But I always wanted to kind of do my own thing on top of that anyways. Like when I got back to my hometown, Chandigarh, I called up one of my friends and I told him this idea of starting an agency. And then we got together and then we smashed it for about 6 years.
So you start this agency. I'm sure you have probably a million stories about what that was like. Biggest success from that time and maybe biggest learning.
One advice that I would give to creative people, especially young designers and creatives who are trying to make an entry into this world of advertising, digital, whatever, is that start broad. Start in a small company where you're given a lot of responsibility. You're doing a lot of things. You're not sleeping enough, because that's when you can really push your body. You can really expand and get exposed to a lot of things. So I would highly recommend, especially for young creatives, to start off with something small, and that's where you learn a lot. Versus, if you were thrown in like a big agency, you would be working on a small thing. They wouldn't really give a shit about you. Or if you actually went into like a product company, then you would be working on this one feature, one thing, right? Unless, that product company was a small company, that's great then.
Yeah.
Start in a company where you are like sort of like a central fabric to everything creative and design. And that way you learn about business, you learn about operations, you learn about resourcing, you learn about how creative ties to business outcomes. You also learn how to grow a team and work with a team and how to get work done from others and how to take orders and how to give orders. So you actually learn a lot. So that's what I would say was one of my biggest learnings from starting my own agency, was that I got to learn what people typically learn in 20 years, in 2 years and 3 years of time. So all that learning got crunched from legal matters to, invoicing to making project plans. All that stuff got crunched down, and it really helped me grow exponentially later in life. So
that's such fantastic advice. Yeah, I think that what you're really talking about there is the scale of the company relative to the scale of the opportunity.
That's why some of my beliefs kind of come from like this: be a practitioner. Stop with all the freaking nonsense of like, oh, I just want to be coming up with the ideas. Like, shut the fuck up. Nobody cares.
Believe me, we will dig deep into that. Quickly hit, what's your biggest sort of like train wreck sort of story? Do you have one from that time period?
Starting a business in itself is you're just going to make like so many mistakes. It's like every day I was making tons of mistakes, from like hiring too many people to not hiring the right people to not sometimes planning enough, because when you're running your own agency, you're thinking about cash flow for the next 6 months to a year. We had to constantly think about, okay, salaries are going to be going every month. How do we make sure that everybody's paid for, and how do we have a stream of projects coming in? So initially, I really struggled with that. I made a lot of mistakes there. One mistake that I definitely remember very clearly is working with a client that I shouldn't have, even when my business partner was like, I don't get a good feeling about this guy. And I was like, when we used to work with clients, they would bring just piles of cash with them because it was an easy way for them to spend their black money. And when somebody had a big pile of cash on the table, it was very hard to say no. So yes, early on when I was like starry-eyed, I made a lot of yeses when I should have made a lot of no's.
You must have had some really strong creative influences to help guide you on that path. That sort of kicked off your not just your love for design, but the type of design that you sort of you gravitated towards. So, is there there's some influences you could speak to that sort of guided you along the way?
My biggest influence was Corbusier, and he's the guy who designed the city that I used to live in. So Corbusier was hired by Nehru, and he was commissioned to design this modern contemporary city. So Corbusier, the Swiss French architect, he came in and he made like the master plan for the city. He designed it on a grid. It was a very Bauhaus, utilitarian, concrete, cement. His analogy was that the streets are the arteries, like the veins and arteries of a human being. So his analogies, his thinking, you know how we have like a golden ratio. He had used a ratio of a human being that he had created, like a man. And so he not only designed like the city, the furniture. He used to also paint. So he was definitely one of my biggest influences in terms of, especially in my early career. And I was really fascinated the way he designed. Like if you think about it now, like, you know how you were describing your story from earlier, that when we started out, you know, when we got our first computers, when we were sketching, drawing, all that stuff, or whatever we were trying to learn, we didn't have resources and internet and all that stuff. And now when you kind of think about people like Corbusier, they didn't have the internet. They didn't have inspirational Pinterest boards. They literally had to think about real problems that people had and then design around them and solution those, right? I feel like they were like the true thinkers of their time. I mean, they paved the path for where we're today. You know, we can totally, you know, use their teachings and learnings. I mean, of course, there's a lot of great examples from graphic design, architecture. But for me, Corbusier was definitely a great, I would say, scaffolding to me becoming a creative person. Yeah. What about you?
I have none. You know, what's interesting is
he's like, I have none. I am already the best.
I have none. I motivated myself. Yeah. No. You know, what I would actually say is I really didn't have any until I went to college. I went for graphic design. But actually, some of the professors that I had were very inspirational. They had worked in the industry for years before moving to teaching, and I got exposed to their way of thinking, which wasn't a particularly artistic leaning view so much as it was a efficacy perspective. Like, does this work for the client? Does this achieve what they needed to achieve? And then can you do that in a way that is distinctly different and artistic? Like, how do you marry all these things together, but always in service of the outcome the client is trying to drive? That would be the really big one, would be that individual professor.
That is insane. I mean, that's the beauty of this profession that we're in, that nobody comes to where they're at in like this linear, beautiful Hollywood style script. Our lives have so many ups and downs, zigs and zags, curves, that I think that's what makes us unique and brings that unique perspective. Also, I would actually be curious to know, what are some of the learnings that you had from athletics that now you brought into your work?
I have honestly never thought about that, but I will do my best. Around the same time I got my first computer, I was about 13 as well. I started speed skating, got into it through a family friend. It was inline speed skating, so a summer variant that's in the Pan American Games. So I got pretty good, made it onto the national team, went to the World Championships a couple of times, and then I spent a year racing professionally in Europe on a World Cup team. I've spent more time in one than the other, but for about a 7 or 8 year period there, I completely dropped designing things to focus literally 100% of my effort on that I was racing for. Or at one point, I started my own team in North America. And that gave me an opportunity to dive really into the branding of that team and how we would represent ourselves, who we would be. And that was probably a lesson in how to be my own client that was very challenging. But the perspective of what can you learn from that sort of thing, I think determination, like you're not going to get anywhere if you're not committed to working hard, working every day, that you're never going to do it alone. You know, there's going to be a community around you that needs to support you to get you to the next level. Especially the better I think you get at something, the more difficult it is to see incremental improvement. And so you have to work that much harder and rely on a larger network to expose you to more things. The other thing that was really interesting is that all of this is outcome driven distances. So I had an annual goal of every year in September, I would go to the World Championships, would do, a certain level of quality. Like I would have a certain placement, minimum placement. And so you would work back. You'd be planning a whole year in advance of, where you wanted to be, the training you'd need to do quarterly, monthly, break that down weekly, and even daily. But then you also needed to learn along the way that, like, what if I break my leg? Something crazy happens you didn't see coming. Like, how do you adapt this plan? Right. And so you have to learn to project far enough into the future for it to be meaningful, but then be flexible in the very short term to adapt to, the day-to-day changes. And I think that was not something I appreciated as being applicable to any other aspect of my life except that specific experience till much later. And now we do planning, at the company that I'm at, we're trying to do annual planning, quarterly planning, all this kind of stuff. I help other people with it. Like, there's all these things when you look at different aspects of your life and you're like, this is all the same thing. You're just taking a different lens.
You had originally started doing websites and design and doing animations, and then you stepped away from it. How many years were you away from your from design and everything? And then what made you actually come back into it?
In total, I did the sport for about 20. But about 7 or 8 years of it was like really focused. And then why back into design? Well, the reality is I did that year professionally. That was the last year I really seriously did the sport. And I realized there's no money in it. That's not what I'm looking for long-term for my life. So what should I do with my life if it's not going to be this? And that's where I fell back into designing things, websites, poster art, motion graphics, animation. I love doing it all. I had my fingers kind of still itching to do it. And so that was it. I came back and I immediately said, okay, I need to get a piece of me a diploma of some sort so I can go get a job to do this for real. And so then I went to school.
I'm trying to even recall, my early days, and I'm thinking like, back then we didn't have websites like Upwork and Fiverr, and how you were described, how you got your first client who was a photographer, and then he got you your second client. So in those early days, how were you getting clients?
It was all word of mouth. Super early days. Literally friends of mine would be creating stupid GeoCities websites. It's just the most obnoxious things you could imagine. And I was like, oh, I know how to do this, and so I would just offer. And so it'd be like personal friends, right? And I'd do it for free. At the beginning, it really was that. It was just leveraging the connections that I had. Steve Harvey, I think I've seen talk about this like 10 by 10 rule, which is effectively, it's like how to make $1 million. It's like start with a $10 idea, do it 10 times. Now you have $100. Now take that $100 idea, do it 10 times, you have 1,000. Repeat often enough, you hit $1 million. Kind of like that. It was just take something that I could do that I didn't know very many other people could do and try to sell it to as many people as I could. And then over time, people begin to know you as that person who does this thing.
What kind of journey took place?
Short version is school for 4 years. And don't get me wrong, I loved it, but it was not, the Silicon Valley startup scene that is very popular today was really beginning to more of a phenomenon. More people knew about it. Facebook was obviously coming up. Google had been around, sort of thing, eBay, etc. And I was like, that is what I want to do. I want to own a business. I want to make a lot of money, and I want to do it doing design. I got a job at a startup in Toronto. I'm going to say 2 or 3 months before I graduated. Everyone else was worried about graduating. I was worried about getting a job. That kind of kicked it off. And then from there, I just went small startup to small startup to small startup. A whole lot of failures along the way. A lot of things that are guaranteed to make your business fail. And now I've been at the company I'm at now for about almost 8 years. We've been going.
While other students were like in their teens, you were in your 20s at that time. And so you were sort of ahead of the curve.
Yeah, I started school when I was 25. And everyone else was 18. I knew what not to waste time on. And I could identify when somebody was teaching me something that was real, that really resonated in my chest. Like it was such an amazing experience to just be able to like pull this knowledge out of someone who'd been doing it for so long and was really good at it. And they're like, okay, I can use that for me.
I remember I feel like this is more of like the diplomatic answer. I remember the answer being like telling the professor that I'll teach you how this class should be taught.
Yeah, well, maybe I said that. And so I already had like years of more experience than the professor who was teaching it. And so he and I had a conversation where he said like, listen, you obviously know more than I'm going to teach you. So you don't have to take the course if you don't want to. We'll just...
By the way, how did that experience compare to earlier when you were kicked out of school?
As a teenager getting kicked out of school, like I was terrified of that moment because my parents were all of a sudden going to find out that I had been pretending to go to school for a year, right? Sneaking back into the basement. Like I would leave and be like, bye, mom. Right? She'd go to work. She'd think I'm going to school. I'd turn around. get back in the house, go downstairs and like literally work on the computer for the next 8 to 10 hours. I remember being on my computer working, designing and building something when 9/11 happened because I had the TV on beside me. So I was not in school when that happened and had to hear from my friends later what it was like to be in school and have that happen. And I was like, yeah, I'm talking to people who are in New York.
Holy
Through a
shit.
chat program right now because they were going to school and they were working on our project and we were sort of like jamming about the project. So it was this like totally surreal moment. Didn't think it was real, watching it happen.
Change in topic, which is, I remember you telling me that over the years, your experiences, you translated that into an Andrew manifesto.
A lot of my philosophy around how I work has nothing to do with design. It really has to do with being inclusive, bringing people into a process. My sort of values and vision for how a design team works is actually a lot about how an entire R&D department works, product, design, and engineering, because the reality is you very frequently work across all three groups to deliver something. So it's about having conversations. It's about acknowledging that the thing that you're building requires an act of co-creation, meaning that each person in the room will equally contribute something to it. And you can't be a hero. You shouldn't try to be a hero. And, I have this amazing idea. It's like, okay, well, let's talk about it. Let's try to pick it apart. Let's try to see if it survives that assault by all these really smart people from different perspectives. So there's that. There's this active co-creation. I also really strongly believe something I'm sure every person who's in a design function, including yourself, appreciates, is that I basically believe that I spend the majority of my time eliminating bad ideas and hoping that through this process, I end up with a good one at the end, or my team ends with a good one. A 3 or 4 week project is actually, say a 4-week project is actually 3 weeks of just coming up with stupid ideas that don't solve anyone's problems, and then acknowledging that they're stupid and wrong, and then putting them over on a pile and say, let's leave those alone, right? And you hope that over time you stop putting things in that pile. And then the other things that are really important to me is just that your product team is really responsible for trying to identify the value you should be providing. Your design team in a product company, and your design team is really responsible for ensuring that your customers can experience that value seamlessly, effortlessly. It's a pleasant experience, and your engineers are responsible for ensuring that it's performant, that it can happen quickly, and that there aren't any bugs. And when you have all three of those parts working really well together, I think that you can deliver extremely meaningful work, but it requires the whole team, right? And it's not just about this sort of like mythical idea that it is a designer is magical and this can't be taught, and all this kind of stuff that I'm sure we've all experienced at some point. You had your agency. It was a pivotal moment in your life. Why leave and come to Canada? What brought you here, and what's the transition been like?
Truth is, Andrew, millions of people across the globe have been curious about the same question. Why has Paul left India? This was actually a very, very tough decision. By the way, it's a very, very good question. And I do get asked that quite a bit, because I had a successful running agency. I had really good clients. I was doing great projects. But at the same time, I was, from a personal and quality of life perspective, not very happy and satisfied. And in fact, I felt that I had hit the ceiling in terms of what I could do creatively in that market. Of course, everybody has their own personal experiences and their own context, their own limitations, their own ceiling, their own mental ceiling, to be specific. And for me, I had one leg in Toronto and one leg in Chandigarh. At some point, you have to make a decision and decide. That will determine what your life is going to look like moving forward from that point on. So it was a hard decision to make. And when I finally took that step, in the beginning, it was very scary because I had to leave all the work I had done, all the connections I'd made, all the relationships I'd built behind, and start from scratch.
Honestly, to make that jump is I don't know. I mean, who knows how hard that is until you actually live it. So I'm super impressed you did that. What was it like after you made that jump to get back into the creative work in Canada? Was that something you did seamlessly? You left in India, here, and you're like, okay, I want to keep doing this work, but how am I going to do it here? Was that true, or was it, something different?
There's like 3 tentacles to this answer. The first tentacle being is that when I moved here, initially, nobody hired me again. I got rejected, and it was kind of a throwback to my days in school. It was a throwback to my early days in Mumbai. Everywhere I applied, I just got like outright rejected. Nobody even wanted to have a conversation with me. I wasn't getting any interviews. I was rejected from Tim Hortons and Starbucks. During this period when I was getting rejected left, right, and center, I kept my head down and I focused on my craft. During this period of rejection, I started this project called 365, in which I would make a piece of art every day and post it online. That project actually got me noticed by this small studio in Toronto called Puncher Design, Spencer and Rashad. Shout out to you guys. And they gave me my first gig. I worked on a music festival with them. And after that, things spiraled up. It was an upward spiral. It was definitely an upward spiral. The second tentacle to that is that it was definitely not easy. Even when I did get hired, I had to start from the bottom and prove myself. But yeah, once I got hired, it became very evident what I could do. And it led me to where I'm now.
That's great. So you really just needed someone to give you a shot, really to believe in you. And I guess that makes sense as to why you have really believe in the owning your craft mentality. Is it's really been responsible for you being able to get off the ground, prove your worth, and continue to grow your career.
This actually comes from my dad, who has always taught me that, focus on your work and let the work speak for itself. And that's really helped cement, everything that I've done in my life. It's played actually a very pivotal role.
So let's dig into that for a second. Were either of your parents, creatively leaning people? Did they play an influence in your development that way?
Absolutely. In fact, my dad was a bit of a rebel because he came from a family which was all business people. He rebelled against that. He moved from Ludhiana, which is a small town in Punjab, to Chandigarh and joined a newspaper. And he was seen as a bit of a rebel because he was a writer. And all the recognition that he got, everything that he built was based on just his craft. So I saw that firsthand. He would go to work at 8:00 in the morning and work till 2:00 at night because the paper was printed at night. So he would be around to see the paper get printed.
Wow, that's amazing. And what about your mom?
My mom was a typical housewife early on, but she later became a school teacher.
I would equate teaching as being a creative and perhaps frustrating endeavor.
Speaking of, influences on, what shaped us as people, as designers, as creative leaders, what were some of your influences and what kind of influence did your parents have on where you're today?
Yeah, I'd say pretty significant ones. My dad, in his free time, almost as an obsession, was into working in carpentry. It got so good at it that in my mind, he's a master carpenter. Like I have seen him build things that are absolutely incredible. And if he was interested in it, I think he could make a lot of money. I have tried to convince him to use this as a business and but he's exceptionally good at it. And when I was younger, my parents got divorced, but we would go and visit, every week or every 2 weeks. And I would always be in his workshop with him, learning how to use the tools, how to put things together, how to turn an idea into this, beautiful piece of functional or not so functional art or what have you. And then for my mom, she wanted to go to school to be an interior designer. And so she didn't. Circumstances weren't exactly in her favor. But what that meant was that I grew up in a household where my mom was always redecorating, always painting. She liked to watch shows on television that were creative in nature. So that meant I watched them. Actually, even though neither one of them did use their creative outlet as a career, they had such a significant part of the way that they lived their lives that it definitely rubbed off on me and I think my siblings as well.
I love hearing like some of these backstories of what got people into the creative side to actually choose creative as a career path, because most of the times, parents or society, they stifle creativity and they're like, oh, you should. And typically in Asian families, it's, you got to be an engineer or a doctor, or some even might suggest lawyer. And luckily, because my dad had rebelled against that, became a journalist, and he's always been like a massive support, which is the definition of creative leadership. He kind of just built the scaffolding around me, and he just let me do whatever I wanted. And he let me take the decisions. He would never take the decisions for me. He would always be like, okay, you should go decide. It's your decision.
That's great.
And that's really helped shape the way I approach problems. I remember like my very early, like very first initial impressions of design came from watching a lot of cartoons and looking at packaging for products and looking at commercials and cartoons on television. I would say that would be my top of the funnel for getting into creativity as a child.
For me, I think it was probably the hands-on stuff with my dad. Probably still number one. But something I think I learned from him, and I twisted it into my own like kind of semi-aggressive sales pitch here, is like he would work effortlessly to be as good as he could possibly be at that creative side of himself. And the story you were just telling about, like, parents wanting their children to be doctors and this sort of thing. Something I heard growing up was stuff like, oh, well, you shouldn't bother trying to be an artist, because an artist, like, painting, right? Or drawing, because you'll never make it a living. Or like, don't become an author because, and I always thought that was bullshit. And the reason I thought it was bullshit, because, you'd have this paired with like, you can be anything you want to be, except everything you might want to be.
The paradox.
Yeah. And I thought that was bullshit, because my approach was like, well, in every single one of those disciplines, there is at least one person making an insane amount of money. And so to me, what that meant was you can go into anything you want to do and you can make a living off of it. You can make a really good living off of it, but you have to be the best. Right. And if you've kind of paid attention to my story, trying to be the best at something is pretty frequently built into there. I don't always succeed, but I think like these things coming together just really meant for me growing up, it's like, cool, you want to be a writer? You have an equal opportunity to be a writer as everyone else. The difference is, will you try to be the best writer, or who has a job? They're different things.
For people who didn't catch that, is that, do you want to have a job or do you want to be the best writer? Basically, the analogy here is that, do you want to get lost in perfection or get the job done? Because sometimes just getting the job done is more important.
Oh, yeah. In business, right? Like literally my day job is about getting the job done and not being perfect, because perfect means I'll never get it done. But going back to something you said earlier about, I think you mentioned this, about always learning, always practicing your craft. You may not have the opportunity to focus on the job to be perfect, right? But the act of seeking perfection is I believe, a really strong motivator. And people who do that, who spend the time to do that, path and satisfaction they're looking for, they get the monetary reward that they're looking for, quality of life, because they go further and they do more than, air quotes here, everyone else who is also doing it. Somebody has to win, right? And the spoils are usually quite good for the winner. So why not have that be you?
There are two really good points there. One is that, especially as when I was a young designer, and this is for other young designers and creative people listening, is that you get kind of stuck in perfecting the work because you want to prove yourself. Whereas I feel now in retrospect, it's the volume of work that I did and just the repetition of the work that I did that got me to a level that other people might feel is perfection. The other thing there is that you grew up in North America. I grew up in India, North India. Yeah. And at that time, India is so different culturally and financially. Everything was so different. So I didn't have any inspiration around me in terms of people that I could look at and say, oh, look, that person's a designer and they drive a nice car. They live in a good house. They live a good life. And I couldn't find any examples of successful artists. All artists around me were just like doing 3 other jobs to sustain themselves.
It's interesting, though. People who do creative acts as a vocation. Someone pays me to build a product, right? There's a creative path there. Someone pays you to create a brand. There's a creative path there. That always seems at odds with art, right? As two separate sort of things. Art for art's sake, if you will, and what we do for business sake. But here's the interesting thing. I have heard it say that a sculptor works on a piece of stone, not to sculpt the stone, but to remove the unnecessary stone from the slab, right? Like the stone knows what it wants to be, and you're just helping the stone, right? And so the thing is, I'm thinking about you, and I'm thinking about, okay, well, if you're helping a company or a person come up with a brand or identity or a strategy, they already know what they want. Your job is to help pull away pieces of the stone, as it were, to help them achieve this vision they have, right? It's not your vision. It's their vision. And so there is a sort of a really interesting parallel, if you want to look at it this way, between the artist and the professional who is in a creative vocation, to say, like, these are kind of the same things. You know, you could say the outcome is you now have a beautiful statue by a master carver, or you have a beautiful brand, beautiful packaging, beautiful product. You still have the same outcome on both sides.
I think that's a great topic for our next episode, which is how do we help businesses and how do we help our teams focus on what's important and remove the crap.
That sounds like fun.
Yeah.
I mean, it might not be fun doing it, but the idea sounds fun.
Yeah, it is fun. Sometimes you got to be a bad guy, but that's one of the things that a creative leader has to do.